Thanks very much. Yes, and yeah, thanks to the ALIA folks for this opportunity to present. It's a lovely big room. So, well, I'm going to launch right into it. I'm talking about kind of a grab bag of things under the banner, a broad banner, of something I'm calling collection space. I'll just give you a quick perspective about where I'm coming from, what my approach to this kind of topic is. So I come from a background as a digital media practitioner, designer, artist, theorist a little bit. I've done a bit of work with digital cultural collections. I make rich, generous interfaces for collections specifically, but a lot of my work is also connected with the worlds of digital art and culture. So, in other words, I'm not a library person, I'm not an information systems person, and so forgive me if I make any terrible faux pas in that direction, but I work with that material quite a lot. I tend to work between theory and practice. I like it when those things kind of go together. So in the talk today, I'll be using a lot of practical examples. I'll be giving a lot of practical case studies and trying to draw some ideas out of those. And in my own practice and in my thinking, I tend to, work a lot with data as a kind of material, as a material to work with and to think with. So I'm treating data in that way in this talk. And there's more of my stuff on the internet there. Okay, so space. Space is the place. Why am I talking about space? What's the use of space as a concept here? Really what I'm talking about is digital collections. That's a sort of phrase that covers a huge range of different things. I'm going to talk quite broadly about the expansive kind of potential. And I think space is a handy concept here because it has some attributes that for me feel quite parallel, quite similar. Space is expansive, it's huge, it contains all kinds of things. We don't know a lot of what it contains, and I think the same is true of digital collections. It challenges us in many ways. It's challenging to deal with because of its size and because of what it contains. And in particular, it invites exploration. It demands that we find out about it, that we gradually understand it. And it seems to require some kind of mapping, some form of representation in order to support that understanding. So for all those reasons, space to me seemed like a handy metaphor. So I'm going to be talking about a few topics, 4 little kind of points that are going to shed some light on aspects of this collection space. The first one is about a couple of little case studies in publishing and mapping big digital collections under the banner of Space is Big. There's some bad space jokes in this presentation, I'll warn you now. So in the second chunk, I'm talking about how we encounter collection space, how it comes to us, how it feels to us, and what we can do with it as a kind of creative material. So looking at samples of collection space and serendipitous encounters. The third one is talking about edges and gaps, picking up a little bit on Tim Sherritt's ideas there, looking at, in particular, the spaces between collections. And I'll give you one little case study of some practical work I did recently, looking at relationships or trying to harvest and represent relationships between collections. And then finally, to wrap up, some thoughts on crowds and algorithms and looking at the sort of worlds of big tech and the digital collections that are out there in the world of the big tech industry and seeing what they can tell us about navigating collection space. So that's where we're headed. To begin with, space is big. I couldn't really say that without this quote. I've always wanted to have a Hitchhiker's Guide quote in a talk, never until now. So yeah, space is big. But collection space, I'm going to look at one specific example of a big collection space which has caught my attention, and I'm going to elaborate some of its attributes that I think are interesting. It's one that you might be familiar with. So you're probably familiar with the work of the Internet Archive, archive.org, and their book digitisation project. So archive.org is a curious organisation, mostly focused on archiving digital material, but now they actually have a big digitisation program. They're not a government-funded library, they're not a public institution in that sense. They're an independent organisation, but they have digitised a lot of stuff, a lot of out-of-copyright print material, and that's available in their web interface, and it has been for quite a while. Around the middle of last year, something interesting popped up on Flickr Commons, a new account called Internet Archive Book Images, which was rapidly populated with a kind of astronomical number of images. They launched with around 2.6 million images, and that number is now gradually increasing. So that in itself got the attention of me and lots of other people. What's going on there, though, is kind of interesting. So I'll look at the sort of elements of this collection, and I'll explain the process by which it came about, and then sort of bring up some of the issues that raises. So this is an example of a record. Each record in this Flickr set is an image with a whole lot of metadata, so you can see the image there of an engraving of a platypus from a book called An Exposition of Fallacies in the Hypothesis of Mr. Darwin by one Charles Robert Bree. There's a bit more of the metadata. So you can see there's a few different elements there. You've got the image. The image has been harvested from a digital book page. I've just marked the bit where the image has been pulled out. And interestingly, it's been harvested as a result of looking at the OCR data. So the books had already been OCR'd. By looking at the spaces on the pages that had not been OCR'd, in other words, where OCR failed, you could pretty easily identify images. So there's a very easy computational way to start pulling images out. The content is marked up with tags, though they're in the form of machine tags. In other words, they're a very formal vocabulary. So you can see the book metadata, the entry metadata is all there in tags. That makes the collection very browsable. So for example, to look at material from a particular book, you could just click the book ID tag to look at a particular book publisher, and so on and so on. So the metadata is instantly browsable. That comes from each book. That metadata is already recorded. And then interestingly, you're also getting OCR'd text. So that's the text that's adjacent to the image, which has been OCR'd. And if you look carefully, like any OCR'd text, you can see it's pretty noisy. It's not 100% accurate at all, but it's okay. So what's even more striking, I think, about this, if you look into the story, is that essentially this was done by one person, a researcher, American researcher called Kaliv Litaru, who wrote some software and of course ran that software over a gigantic existing archive, the archive of digitized books. But as a result of that sort of little combination, was able to pretty readily give rise to an archive of this scale. And it's not just the scale, it's the reasonably rich metadata that all of those images have. So there's quite a bit of value that's there. So this, I think, is interesting in a number of ways. If you compare, in a naive way, if you compare it to the digital collections that we're used to seeing that come through traditional channels, big institutions, and long, expensive processes of digitisation, it seems like a crazy kind of contrast. How can it be so rapid and so easy to produce such a vast amount of material? That's true to a certain extent, although when you look at the content, the actual content of the collection, I think it kind of gets even stranger and more interesting. So here's just a random page. I really recommend browsing this collection. It's just mad. So here's a random page, and you can see quite quickly the kind of incredibly eclectic content that we've got here. But even aside from the eclectic content, you'll notice a few odd things. So for example, not all of these things are really images. There's some stuff that is clearly text, but that hasn't been OCR'd as text and therefore has been harvested as an image. So it's something that a computer decided was an image rather than being text. There's also notated music. There's lots of advertising material. There's handwriting, which has not been OCR'd. There's also image material, which is image, but is, for example, oriented incorrectly. There's an image there that's on its side. So in other words, what we're seeing here is an incredibly kind of raw, unmediated sort of computational stream of material that's coming out of this collection. So, in that sense, there's a question about kind of the quality of this material, in the sense that, if a library or an archive was publishing this material, this would probably be a concern. They'd probably go and say, oh no, we can't, that's not an image, we won't publish that. Oh, that one's sideways, we'd better turn it around. So, this is what we would normally expect. The other thing that I think comes out really rapidly here is ideas about significance and value. So, again, if I was an archive or a library and I was publishing stuff on Flickr Commons, I would probably, the normal practice, because that process of publishing material, even on Flickr Commons, even if it's already digitised, that's pretty resource intensive. And so you're going to pick the really good stuff, the really interesting, important stuff that you believe is significant, and you're going to focus on that, really show that off. And that's, as a result of that, we get great Flickr streams like State Library of New South Wales and all the other institutions that publish to Flickr. And they typically have of the order of, sort of 1,000 to 5,000 images in their stream. This is several orders of magnitude more stuff. But as a result of that, of there being, in a sense, no filter for significance, you get all kinds of strange things. You get advertising, you get ephemera, you get odds and ends. And that, I actually think, makes the collection incredibly rich. Strange, but also incredibly rich. So there's some strange relationships going on in this collection between these kind of parameters. Effectively, in this process, what we've seen is the cost of publishing a collection as a result of material being already harvested and a whole lot of other things being favourable, in other words, rights, being clear and all that kind of stuff. The cost of publishing this collection is reduced to be almost insignificant. As a result, the scale goes through the roof. It's gigantic. At the same time, what you might consider to be quality, the sort of veracity of the correctness of the metadata, the veracity of the digitised material, everything being good and proper, is a little bit variable. And what about significance? Is it significant? Well, there's certainly some of it that's significant. Is it all significant? Well, who knows? And the interesting thing to me is that it seems that as the cost drops to zero, the question of significance, in a way, it actually doesn't matter, because when the cost is so low, the principle can be just save it all, because we don't know what's going to be significant. We can't necessarily tell now what's going to be significant, in the future or to someone else. So as a result, you have this incredibly broad collection, insanely eclectic, but with amazing potential for undreamed of value and significance to come out. So for me, that's an interesting little case study in what happens when you get computation working in quite a powerful way at this large scale with digital collections. Now, given a collection of that scale, what do you do with it? How do you represent it? How do you even begin to understand it? Publishing into Flickr has some advantages. So Flickr has reasonably good search, and obviously the machine tags make the collection quite browsable, so there's some good starts. But how would you even go about understanding that scale, the scale of that space? Turns out that it's quite doable. This is the work of a designer called Mario Klingemann, and it is a map of the subjects that are contained, the subject metadata that is contained in those images and that is inherited from the books that are digitised. And it's big. So what you're seeing here is a map, essentially a little bit like a tag cloud, where you can see the subject terms notated. And you can also see, through interaction, relationships between those terms. So birds is related to zoology, for example, and other terms. The distance between terms is going to be roughly related to the amount of relationships. So there's a layout algorithm which is at work here, which is making related things appear relatively closely. So we're seeing a kind of spatial map of relationships. So you can see medicine, anatomy, and surgery are all joined together. I might not show you an example from those ones. Look at all those street railroads though. Perhaps some hydroelectric power plants. Of course, because it's a digital interface, it's also a live connection into the collection. So this is now running a search in Flickr, so we can immediately see all of the images that have the subject metadata for hydroelectric power plants. Gee, my network connection's really slowed down. It's all you people tweeting. So this is a great example of you know, the swings and roundabouts of you know, significance. A lot of what is in this archive is this incredible primary material. These are, you know, plans and documents that are, you know, technical documents essentially, which to me is both fascinating and incredibly evocative stuff. So representing a collection at this scale is an incredible challenge, certainly, and this is far from, you know, the most usable representation. But again, what this shows is that there are computational ways of getting a grip on this stuff, and that it can be represented. And so this does help us to sense some of the qualities of this collection space, some of its relationships, some of its contents. And even though it does it in a very prosaic way, it hides the images from us and removes the visual information, brings it just down to text. There is quite a lot of structure in here. So mapping very large spaces, yes, it's possible. And it raises some interesting questions for me about, what do we expect from these kinds of maps? What kind of navigation can we have in spaces that are this large? And what kind of browsing, you know, we can't meaningfully browse a space that's this big, but we can dip into it. We'll be looking at some examples in a little bit later of other ways of dipping in. Here's another great example, which is a different collection, but a similar kind of mapping technique. This is the work of a guy called Glenn MacDonald. And this project is called Every Noise at Once. I'll just load it up over here. Glenn MacDonald is a data wrangler for a company called the EchoNest. The EchoNest manage music metadata. They were recently acquired by Spotify. So essentially they're managing the sort of metadata, organising metadata for all of the world's digitally available streaming music. So about 30 million tracks of streaming music. For me, this is a great example because it shows the way that the concerns of, you know, libraries and archives and you know, sort of document-based or traditional collections, if you like, is smashing into and merging with the world of kind of born digital collections and native online collections. In this case, the collection that's behind this is Spotify. It's 30 million songs. And that material is already digital. It's on the internet, and in fact, you can stream it all instantly. So what you get is this increased flattening of map, interface, and space, collection space, with the contents of that space. What we're looking at here is a map of genres, because Glenn MacDonald's responsibility is actually the kind of care and feeding of the genres in the EchoNest data library. And I don't know if you can see or read any of these genres, but well, first of all, there's quite a lot of them. Second of all, there's probably some there that you haven't really heard of. Let me see. What does vegan straight edge sound like? You can actually find out, is the fun thing. On the other hand, Celtic Christmas music sounds like this. I'll just stop that. Oh, that's better. This space has axes. The axes are roughly. Yeah, up is sort of more mechanical and electric. So this is sort of content-based metadata or classification. So there's acoustic analysis of the actual musical material to generate some parameters here. So up is sort of more mechanical, down is more organic. So down here you've got sort of choral music and cello music and opera and so on. Left is, what does he say, denser and more atmospheric. Right is spikier and bouncier. So that sort of describes the space. And then, of course, you can actually dig in a little bit further. So if we want to know what outside a house is, we can then look at a map of artists who are associated with outside a house, and then we can investigate the music of Zosar, for example. So there you go. And it'll also show us some related genres here. There's much more here as well. There's a whole lot of great stuff to explore here. You can have it in a much more straightforward list format. So this is a list of genres that are associated with that one by similarity. You can also, include only mainstream music, for example. It's all a big web application. It works remarkably well. So what's interesting for me here is, once again, this is a gigantic collection. It's actually way bigger than the Internet Archive Books collection, 30 million items, which have been aggregated up into these genres. And I'm going to come back to this collection a little bit later in talking about algorithms and the sort of human and computational sort of hybridity of these processes. So again, we can represent this space, but the representations are kind of close to being overwhelming in themselves. But again, there's this flattening of interface and content, and the immediacy of being able to sample a collection from the interface level to instantly pick a sample out is illuminating to a tremendous extent. You'll notice, those of you who know my kind of my history with search boxes, there's a search box. So if you want to find an artist, you can. In other words, so if you have a known target, you can find your target in this space. Okay, so big collections and the way that computation gets involved in both publishing them and then mapping them. Part 2. So given that this stuff is out there, how does it come to us? How does it impact on us? How do we get a sense or a feeling of what it is? I've just shown you a few very simple examples, but I'm going to show you a few more that take a more hands-on approach, I guess. So processes where we're harvesting, processing, sampling, and remixing the contents of collection space. I'm going to start with a Twitter bot. This is the work of Tim Sherritt, Trove News bot. The first, I think, of now a kind of growing army of collection Twitter bots. If you haven't encountered Trove News bot, it's a wonderful being. Trove News bot tweets random materials from the Trove digitised newspapers collection, but also tweets material that's not random, but that's actually relevant to current news topics. So it harvests news keywords from ABC, I believe, and then tweets related content. So you can see there's a Trove newspaper article in relation to a specific current news item. So this 1914 article about Tasmanian Liberals, clearly relevant to the current news. So Tim talks and writes very eloquently about Twitter bots, and you can see them being taken up. For me, what's important here is that it provides a different way for us to encounter collections, and it's a form of encountering that is the reverse of the usual kind of seeking and sort of active, inquisitive kind of process whereby we go digging for material and excavate it, bring it up. This material just kind of rains down kind of in our social media stream. It comes to us, and we can stumble over it and find it and perhaps be distracted and engaged, and who knows, perhaps, find really interesting stuff and go on to do meaningful things with it. So this idea of having a kind of way of encountering a collection that is ambient, that is just incidental, it's just around in our everyday digital environment, I think is incredibly powerful. And you can see these being taken up in other Twitter interventions. It's interesting to compare this with the sort of 5 years ago trends, and there's still quite a bit of activity around publishing into repositories like Flickr, where again, Flickr is really about inquiring and digging out of a specific, published social media kind of archive. Twitter it's a different service. It has a different kind of flow. It's something that comes to us rather than us going and actively browsing. So Trove Newsbot is a leading kind of example of this kind of bots. I'll show you another bot that I have a little bit of a connection with, which leads us into some more abstract and poetic kind of experiments. This is the Blahniks Archive Twitter bot. Blahniks Archive is the archive of a poetry publisher called Blahniks Books. It's an archive that was recently acquired by Newcastle University in the northeast of England, and where I was on sabbatical last year, and I did some work with that archive that I'll show you later. So what the Blahniks Archive bot does, though, is tweets material from the collection, but it tweets it in a strange way. In particular, what it tweets is marginalia. So on the left-hand side, you see a digitised page from the Blahniks Archive. So what you can see, it's a book manuscript, it's a table of contents, it's been extensively marked up by the editor with a whole lot of notes and marginalia. Now, in an echo of the Internet Archive process, my friend Tom Schofield, the researcher working on this project, worked out that you could actually extract the marginalia from these pages just by looking at the bits that the OCR didn't get. So by finding the gaps in the OCR, you get all of the things that actually are hand annotations. And this material, which would otherwise have been the detritus, would have been thrown away, not OCR'd and therefore not represented in the digital collection. He was concerned to actually foreground this material, so to actually focus on it. So let's look at just the marginalia. Let's pull it out of context. And so what you get are these beautiful inverted images with just the marginalia. They give you these bizarre kind of clues and hints at some kind of material or content which you can't actually see, or you can only see tiny pieces of it. It's incredibly poetic, but it's also a very critical stance. It's a very critical response to the attributes of a digitisation and archiving process. It's a way to take the kind of values that are implicit in something like OCR, which says, okay, printed text is what we're interested in, and turn it around. And of course, if you're dealing with an archive that's edited, then the work of the editor, the agency of the editor, expressed in those annotations, is very important. So it's something that is certainly of concern. So what the Blahniks Archive bot does is tweets you random bits of marginalia from the collection. Now Tom's work has also extended with this marginalia to this wonderful gadget, which is called the Marginalia Machine. I won't show it to you in full, but you can look it up. The Marginalia Machine is essentially a robot, a drawing robot, that draws the marginalia, redraws it, takes it out of the archive, and using a beautiful pen, inscribes it very carefully on bits of tracing paper. And this has been shown publicly several times. So as a form of engagement with a collection, to me, this is kind of as wacky as I get, and also really wonderfully inspiring, in that, you know, a collection can be expressed through a physical device which has a sort of digital, feed and is generating physical artifacts. So you can actually go and take away a piece of tracing paper with this digitally inscribed marginalia kind of reappearing on it. So this work in part is responding to some research that was done around this archive and people's thoughts and responses to the archive. And the materiality of the archive was an incredibly strong theme. In other words, what people responded to in looking at this archival material was its material qualities. And so, of course, when you're dealing with a digital archive and digitisation, the question, of course, is how do you represent those material qualities that tend not to be represented in digital records? And this work is really an effort to rematerialise the archive in a very beautiful and poetic way. Some more work from Tim Sherritt. I think Tim touched on this one, so I won't give you the full demo, but Tim's Eyes on the Past is again a beautiful example of a really poetic kind of slice into a collection, and something that again is using a computational technique as a kind of key tool. So here the computational technique is face detection and even the feature detection within those faces. And by using that technique as a kind of lens, it's pulling out content from within a very large collection and then literally giving us windows in, giving us ways back into that collection so we can navigate from the eyes and the faces back into their original context and provenance. And again, this isn't a sort of a kind of broad scale, general purpose interface. It's a bespoke, very carefully crafted and very poetic, very specific interface. When I saw this work, I was ribbing Tim that he was gradually turning into a digital media artist, because I think this is incredibly beautiful work. But for me, it raises this really interesting point about what kind of poetics, what kind of creative practice is it to work with these collections and to do these very strongly authored, very critical, very specific kind of interventions with collections. I think it's a really exciting form of practice. I'm going to show you a project of mine which is really talking about the same thing. I seem to be going okay for time as well. This work is called Succession, and it's one of the outcomes to come from my visit to Culture Lab at Newcastle University last year. It's really a response to a whole lot of things, including the city of Newcastle. Newcastle, if you don't know it, is a sort of post-industrial Northern English city, which has been through an incredible process of change, through the 20th century, from being a real sort of hotspot of industrialisation, massive coal mining, and then the centre of one of the centres of British shipbuilding, to dealing with kind of deindustrialisation. And that's evident, in the physical city itself. You can see that everywhere as you walk around. And for me, it really brought up quite a broad and for me, very important question about, well, how does this kind of change occur, and how do we think about what is industrialisation now, and where are we in relation to industrialisation? Are we now post-industrial, or is it just that our industrialisation has gone somewhere else? And how do we think about what a city is, as industry changes? Like many other, post-industrial cities, there's been a lot of effort to do things like to seed, the creative industries, for example, or universities and education, or kind of knowledge industries as an alternative, as a way to replace the capacity that disappeared with heavy industry, and that's been successful, but not completely successful. So anyhow, so all of that's kind of context. What this work really does is looks in a digital archive of material about the city of Newcastle. So it's really mining the past, and it's trying to create these things that I think of as fossils. So, Newcastle, of course, is built on fossil fuels. In fact, Western industrial culture is built on fossil fuels. So by taking these materials, these images, I'm kind of mining the past of the city, and then what I want to do is actually create new fossils. I want to squash them back together, make these new things that have the kind of compressed quality that a fossil has. A fossil is kind of compressed energy. And so in the same way, I hope that some of these composites, these fossils that this work generates, might have a little bit of energy. They might be able to spark some kind of thoughts or provocations. They might make some strange juxtapositions that might make us think about something. So it's about recombining material in a way that is trying to provoke new meanings, new sensations, new feelings, and lead us to think about this material in a different way. So Succession generates these. It's in the process of generating one of these fossils at the moment. Essentially, that's taking harvested data that I more or less hand-selected from Flickr. It's a corpus of about 2,000 images. Squashes them together using a very simple algorithm into a new image. But it also shows us the source images. It shows us the sources of that composite and allows us to go and navigate those. Oh, that's quite a nice one. Just zoom in on that. So we can now see the elements that make up that composite, and we can go and investigate them. Now, this is all a little bit connected because a lot of this comes from the Internet Archive books stream, because it is so incredibly rich. So that's the source of that image. And of course, because of the way that this material is digitized, you can then go and investigate the provenance of that. So this is from a book of book plates from the late 1800s, and we can go and investigate the book and all of the related material. You can see the crazy OCR going on there. So in other words, this material, again, like Tim's Eyes on the Past, this is a way into a whole lot of very rich and sort of densely sort of encrusted digital material with lots of provenance and lots of context that you can go and investigate. So by pulling this stuff out, decontextualizing it, making some strange new thing, we can do that without ever severing the context. We can keep the context, and in fact, I'm encouraging people here to go and investigate this material. And I like the interplay of having the new thing, the decontextualized thing, the new artifact side by side with its sources. For me, that's an important kind of process. The other thing that happens here is you can save things that you like. So if I like this one, I can save it, and it goes into the list. So there's about 130 odd that have been saved so far, and not by me, by mostly other people. You don't have to log in, you can just save something. I'll take your word for it that you think it's worth saving. And then you can go and investigate the composites that other people have saved. Every composite has a permalink, so they all have a URL. So if you like this one, for example, then it has a unique ID that you can go and paste into Twitter and send. And importantly, the ID gets you not just the composite image, but it gets you the sources. So the composite and its source material stay together. So for me, this was a lot of fun because it was a way of dealing with a collection that was, first of all, not another visualization. I love collection visualization. I still think it's very important, but I've been doing quite a lot of it, and I think there's other forms of engagement, and those poetic and critical forms of engagement that I mentioned before were really inspiring me to produce this work. It's a little bit slow to navigate back in there. Every now and then, you do get a spark from this work. This one I quite like. This diagram is a diagram of chocks that are, I think it's to do with stabilising the load in probably coal ships. Then in the background here you've got West Wallsend Colliery in the late 19th century. And interestingly, that's from State Records New South Wales. So the other thing that's happening here is we're aggregating material from actually a wide range of different sources. This strange object here is a diagram of a water pump valve. So out of these relationships, you sometimes get these resonances which can be quite fun. Okay, so in all of these encounters, you get they're important because they give us a kind of closeness. They get us up close to the material, and the material can affect us. We can feel it in a very direct and sometimes powerful way. But also, importantly, all of these are super authored. They are the work of people being authors, doing things, making choices, having opinions, having points of view, having values. So this is incredibly important, and we have to accept and understand that in this kind of work especially, there's always going to be an authored point of view. And that's a value of the work, not a limitation of it. These are critical in that they have a point of view, and often they're actually responding critically to attributes of the collections that they're dealing with. They're very often playful, that they're dealing with the stuff lightly and with a sense of openness of possibility, rather than with a sense of, I must be absolutely faithful to the original sense of this thing, and that's the only sense that can ever pertain. And then potentially these things can be transformative, so they can take the content and change it, remix it, do something else with it, turn it into something else. So that's unlocking a kind of potential in the material which is maybe latent, hadn't yet been articulated. And it's only by really doing this, only by trying what happens if we squash all these things together. It's only by trying that we can see what that potential is. And the other thing that's coming back as a theme, of course, is that in all of these cases, there's a real close relationship between a human authorial agency and a set of choices and explorations and designs, and the kind of computational tools that are being put to work, harvesting, doing face recognition, for example, even something as simple as harvesting material from the Flickr API is a computational process. So this human and computational agency working very closely together. Okay, let's look a little bit at edges and connections. This is not, I'll have to flag this now, this is not a presentation about linked data. I am a linked data novice. This project does involve consuming some linked data, but it doesn't involve any publishing, and as I said, it's me dipping a toe in the world of linked data, so I'll give you that caveat up front. But the kind of territory that we're dealing with here should be fairly familiar. We have collections, and I think in general we tend to think of collections as kind of discrete entities, but it's becoming increasingly clear that of course they're not, that of course there's lots of other collections out there, and what do you know, lots of these collections are really talking about the same things. So how can we express the fact that these different collections are talking about the same things, whether that same thing is a person or a place or creative work or whatever it may be. So how can we articulate these connections, and can we use those connections to actually enrich our views of the collections? And that was specifically my question here. How can we see past the edge of a collection? And one of the ways of seeing past the edge is to use other collections as sources of structured information. So I'll give you a little case study here. Again, this is coming from the Blahniks Archive project, which contains about 60,000 digitised pages, which are mostly organised around book manuscripts. And I'll just introduce you to that archive now. I did a very simple exploration of the authors in this collection. So this is a little live demo. There's a related interface on the Blahniks Archive site. This is a list of the authors who are published with Blahniks books. It's quite a lot. On the left-hand side, you're seeing a very simple timeline of the published works. So the little red squares are Blahniks books. They're books published by Blahniks Press. But of course, writers don't only publish with one publisher. And my initial question here was, okay, so how can we see past the edge of this collection? We've got people, we've got authors who presumably write things. What else have they written? And what can we tell about these authors from what else they've written? So the other portion of this data is that. So the blue and green dots are non-Blahniks works published by the same authors. And that immediately gives you a different view of the collection. So for example, we can look at, this is sorting by number of books, so these are the most prolific authors. And you can see the number of books that they've produced, but also where are the Blahniks books in that CV. So, you know, there are people who've only published a few Blahniks books but have very long careers publishing other stuff. This material is harvested from the British Library. I'll just show you a quick example. So there's an example of someone who has only 3 Blahniks books but a very long line of other books. So basically the process here was not pretty straightforward. The principle was straightforward, which was use the British National Bibliography data, which is an authoritative sort of linked data source on bibliographies, find the Blahniks authors in that bibliography, find their other works, and then represent those works in this visualization so we can see the relationship between Blahniks books and other stuff. So that works reasonably well. Immediately you can get a sense of the different qualities of people's careers. You find things, for example, like there are people who Blahniks mostly publishes poetry, so there are people who publish poetry with Blahniks, but who publish other stuff with other publishers. They might also write children's books, or they might write science fiction books, or other things. So you get a more diverse sense of who these people are. It doesn't tell you that much, though, unless you're a really literary person and you can see from the publishers they publish with and all of the books they're writing, you know, what it is that they're up to. I also harvested a second set of data organised around these individuals, and it's from Wikipedia. So these blue chips here are categories that are drawn from Wikipedia. I won't go into the detail except to say that Wikipedia categories are quite powerful forms of descriptive metadata that are baked into Wikipedia pages and that are harvestable via their API. So they're not really strictly linked data in that they're not published in a linked data way, but they are reasonably high quality descriptive metadata. So you can see that John Montague here belongs to these categories, which is telling us quite a bit about him. We can tell that he's an Irish writer and a poet, and that he also is a Guggenheim Fellow, and that he's a living person, which is maybe not that interesting. But for example, in the brackets after these categories, you can see the number of other people, other authors in the Blahniks Archive who are also in that category. So for example, here are all of the Guggenheim Fellows in the Blahniks Archive. Now that is information that's only available because we've gone and scraped it from Wikipedia and brought it in. So we're using the edge, something that's over the edge of the collection, that's somewhere else, to pull it back in and then structure the little bit of the collection that we do have. Then we can find out a bit more about these people. So a lot of these people have won prizes. Here's all the people that have won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry, for example. There's even, for example, where they went to university, people from the University of Pennsylvania. Something that I discovered quite soon after starting to work with this data was how strong Blahniks is in publishing American poets, and especially also both American and English poets of Jamaican descent. I just can't find any right now, but there's a big cluster of Jamaican poets in here. And so again, as someone who doesn't know the collection, I'm not a scholar of poetry, I don't know these people individually, but I can very quickly, from the structure that we're getting out of the Wikipedia data, I can find that out. So that's a really simple little example of working with material that's sort of beyond the edge of a collection and starting to see how, in practice, we can use some linked data ideas to enrich the view of a single collection. And I'm going to skip very quickly over the process of doing it, except to say that it was fairly arduous. So it involved doing things like this, working with, this is the linked data portal for the British National Bibliography. Anyone ever written a Sparkle query? Oh, a few hands. Yeah, it took me a while to work that out. So this is one of the Sparkle queries that my harvester generates. This is the Wikipedia API, so this is the data that's coming in, category data that's coming back out of the Wikipedia API. That, by comparison, was a walk in the park compared to Sparkle. So what we're doing then is taking one archive, one quite constrained archive, Blahniks Archive, and using two other collections, separate collections, to kind of triangulate, seeing those relationships enriches the collection tremendously. It gives us a different view. So my thoughts, after that experience were, yes, it's first of all, yes, it's doable. We can do this. We can look past the edge of a collection and we can import data that is going to enrich a collection. But the process is anything but seamless. There's a lot of fudging, there's a lot of missed correspondences, there's a lot of glitches and errors, there's quite a bit of manual kind of cleanup and conformance that still needs to happen. In other words, the promises of linked data in terms of being joined up and correct are not really evident to me in this process. That's not to say we shouldn't try and do it, because I think it's incredibly valuable, but it's going to be, again, a process that isn't automatic. It's going to require a lot of, engaged kind of work. Again, human work and computational work in close relationship. Okay, quite quickly, I'm going to run you through some interesting stuff from the world of algorithms and AI and from the stuff that the big tech people are doing in this space. You might have noticed this in the media recently. Google announced a so-called breakthrough in machine learning in terms of the description of images. So under that image are two captions. One of them was supplied by a human and one of them was supplied by a piece of software. What's interesting is that supposedly this is a deep learning method, which means that it doesn't use normal training techniques that machine learning tends to learn or tends to use. So what they've presented is a software program that can caption unstructured images. So it can take a set of pixels, which is an image, and go, oh, yep, that's a group of people playing frisbee, which is pretty crazy. And yet, if you dig into it, the story gets a little bit more complex. Well, first of all, here's something that is quite amazing. So in terms of machine learning and digital collections, have a look at Transcriptorium, the wonderful software project to come out of the Transcribe Bentham project. that Melissa Terrace is involved in. This is a piece of machine learning software that transcribes handwritten manuscripts. So what you can see here is a manuscript. This is a Bentham manuscript. The regions, the dark regions over the lines of text, is the software identifying a line of handwritten text. And in the text box is the text transcription of the selected polygon there. And it's correct, yeah. So this is incredible. This has incredible promise for the transcription into full digital text of handwritten digital of digitized documents. Absolutely amazing. But this is also really interesting. It turns out that these image recognition programs, that the kind of machine learning software which is doing this image recognition, whatever it's doing, it doesn't see things like we see things. This table shows you some images that have been classified in specific ways and labelled with specific terms by a machine learning algorithm. And yet you can see clearly that they are not the thing that they claim to be. And this is over 99.9% certainty. So in other words, the algorithm is just about dead certain that that is a king penguin. And it doesn't really seem to be a king penguin. So, I mean, this is, for me, really interesting in that it's showing us that whatever's going on in there, it's not something that we recognise, which raises some interesting questions about how we use these techniques to do content extraction and metadata and improvement, all these kinds of things that we might want to use them for. So what are, very quickly at the end, I'm just going to talk about what people like these guys are doing with digital collections, because essentially people like Pinterest, Netflix, Spotify, they're actually really in the business of managing gigantic digital collections. And algorithms in machine learning and other algorithms are a big part of what they do. So I think it's interesting to look and see. So Pinterest, ridiculously big, 30 billion pins, items of content, very large user base. There's some very interesting stuff that they've published about what they're building, and a key part of it actually is that they're really using human curation. In other words, it's the Pinterest users and their behaviour, the things that those users are associating, that is supplying a lot of the intelligence, a lot of the structure. That is then being baked back into the data models that Pinterest is using, and they're using that to curate and to sort of provide discovery for their users. So there's a very strong emphasis on human curation. If you look at what other people are doing, Spotify, I talked about Glenn McDonald's work before. So Spotify has this gigantic library. They have an algorithm that identifies related content as a result of user behaviour. So people listening to music, revealing clusters of music that are related. But then what is that cluster of music? It actually takes a human, in this case it's Glenn McDonald, to listen to that cluster and go, is this coherent? Is it a genre? Do we know what it is? Can I describe it? If so, what is it? He got some stick for inventing a genre that he called Metropolis, which everyone just went, come on, that's not a thing. And he argues that it is, that it's distinctive and that you can identify that these artists are associated with it. It sounds like this, it's distinctive in this way. So again, there's a really strong relationship between algorithmic analysis and then a sort of human curation and feedback. And Netflix, of course, if you haven't read Alexis Madrigal's account of Netflix, is fantastic. So Netflix generated a really complex controlled vocabulary, a taxonomy, and hand-tagged, hand-annotated their library of content with all kinds of features, plot, characters, settings, the ending, whether it's happy or sad, how much romance is in it, heaps and heaps of other things. They call it Netflix quantum theory. And out of those quantum tags come these genres which are made by just gluing together the parts of those, or the attributes of those clusters. So you get feel-good foreign comedies for hopeless romantics, for example, and that is a thing. There is a group of content that is associated with that invented genre. So in other words, once again, it's a combination of human and computational processes. It's not a magic kind of wand of automation. There's a very complex negotiation at work here. So I'm nearly out of time, but I'm just going to wrap up quite quickly. There's something that I've been coming back to again and again here is this combination of human and computational kind of process, which I think is utterly distinctive. In this case, though, what we're also seeing is computational plus very large numbers of human agency, which is, of course, really important. Okay, so back to space. What's in here? Well, there's obviously a lot of stuff in here. There's lots of new knowledge. There's lots of potential for new value. Lots also of potential for delight, which I think is important, engagement, kind of feeling. This is really important for me in that we need to be clear-headed about what this relationship is and how it works. In order to understand the kind of agency or the ways that we work with these spaces, we need to understand the relationships between human and computational agency. That means being critical about the computational processes that are at work. That might mean being literate in those processes, in other words, being able to read and write them, but not necessarily. It might just mean knowing enough to be dangerous or knowing enough to have a critical point of view. But I think we have to be open-eyed about the kind of computational processes that are going on in the collections that we're working with to know how to leverage them, use them, for good instead of evil to do what we want, but be able to actually understand the fallibility, the idiosyncrasies, the weirdness of those computational processes and to steer them, in a human way. Ultimately, though, why does all this stuff matter? Why is this space so exciting? The bottom line is, with the digitisation of culture and with the increasing presence of our contemporary culture in a digital form, the collection space matters because it's where our culture lives now. It is the repository. It is the domain of our shared heritage. And so, thinking about how we understand it, how we reflect on it, is kind of crucial for going forwards as a civilised culture. And that's all from me. Thank you.